When people discuss Star Rail, a very frequent topic is investment and what it looks like on your account. This is the case because the kind of investments that you've made on your account will obviously shape the decisions you make and decide how you move forward. However, the term investment often means far more than you think, and there are many different ways to invest in a character. Now, for people familiar with my previous videos, the term investment has been discussed quite a lot, often in relation to vertical investment. And while the importance of it can't be understated, I feel as though my use of the term may lead people to believe that investment can be boiled down to either vertical or horizontal investment. However, my intent for this video is to broaden your horizons on the term, and to hopefully convince you of the many ways investment can impact your account. So then, I think it'd be best if we can get a clear definition of the term investment. Well, depending on the use of the term, it can be used to mean a multitude of different things. However, in the context of Star Rail, I define it as the allocation of resources into a character or a team. So while your immediate thought would likely be about Eidolons or light cones, it could also include things like relics, time, pulls, and even things like knowledge. Essentially, so long as you've put your energy into obtaining these things, that's a resource that you've invested into these characters. Now, the funny thing with investment is that the value it brings differs a lot, not only between different characters, but also a person's account. Some characters will want you to invest in ways that are entirely different from another, but almost all of them benefit greatly from any form of investment. So then, understanding the multitude of ways to invest and gaining a deeper understanding of what investments matter most for a character is pivotal if you wish to get faster clears. But let's address the thoughts that many people tend to default to: the impact of Eidolons. Now, this is far from a new topic for me, and I have no wish to tread old ground, so I'd like to bring a different perspective to this topic: Eidolon Synergy. Now, at this point, I'm sure many people are aware of the very strong Eidolons for the character they like, but there's far less attention on the nuance that having specific Eidolons can bring to team building. For instance, everyone is aware of how strong E0 Phainon is, and are also aware that Syringe's E1 is often the next stopping point, as it provides a lot of flexibility and a rare source of damage amp for Phainon's team. But what if I said that owning Syringe's E1 can significantly increase or decrease the value of your other teammates, depending on what investment route you're on? To know why I'd say that, it's important to first understand that Phainon has two investment routes: his Sparkle teams and his Cyrene teams. Now, if we're going into specifics, the Sparkle rendition can be substituted by using Sunday or Bronya, but Sparkle is often the best variation of the team for now, and has the additional upside of being entirely free. But with that out of the way, it's easy to conclude that Phainon can either have the composition of Saridra, Cyrene, and RMC, or Saridra, Sparkle, and any decent core flame generator, with RMC usually being the best option yet again. But Syringe's E1 does two very strong things for this team. It provides Death Shred for Phainon, something he appreciates greatly, and doubles Syringe's core flame generation. Now, while the Death Shred will always be helpful, the truth is that the second part of Syringe's E1 is wasted in the Cyrene variant, as obtaining Phainon's ult is tied to Cyrene's stack generation in that team, hence why RMC is so pivotal. However, in the Sparkle variant, the focus is shifted back onto Phainon, so Syringe's E1, doubling her core frame generation, is very relevant. Because of this, Syringe's E1 opens the floor for almost any buffer to become the last slot in Phainon teams, which is very important, since many core flame generating supports often give buffs that he doesn't want. However, the supports that provide the stats that he does want, namely Death Shred, vulnerability debuffs, and Res Pen, are often put on supports that provide 0 core flames. So then, having Syringe's E1 can allow you to run those strong supports, while still reaching Phainon's ultimate at a reasonable speed. Furthermore, even in situations where you'd opt to continue using a core flame generator as the last slot, namely RMC, who's just a very strong teammate for Phainon, you'd still benefit from Syringe's E1. This is because obtaining core flames very quickly is extremely important for every second Phainon ult, and onward, as you'd want to prioritize minimizing your time outside of Phainon's transformation as much as possible. With all this being said, For an account that owns E1 Ceridra, or E2 Dipped, the value of Cyrene and her variation of Phainon's team lowers dramatically. However, for someone that owns Cyrene, the value of E1 Ceridra and E2 Dipped lowers as well. So while it's not that hard to see the numerical value of an Eidolon for a team, it's important to recognize that Star Rail is a team game, so learning the synergies between the Eidolons you own can drastically alter what's the best way to invest for you. But the nuance doesn't stop there, as Eidolons are far from the only factor that defines investment. So then, let's shift our focus to something that requires 0 stellar jades to obtain: Relics. Now beyond jades, the most valuable resource in this game is Trailblaze power, or resin for those who are familiar with Genshin. Using your Trailblaze power efficiently is often the source of many headaches, as knowing the most cost-efficient cavern to farm and obtaining strong relics could be very time-consuming. But an important aspect to understand is that the value of relic quality fluctuates greatly between different archetypes, and the priorities for each party member could dramatically increase or decrease the speed of farming. For instance, for most hypercarries, the difference between having 20 effective substats and 40 effective substats are often a night and day difference. On the other hand, a team like Dot gains far less from having crazy substats, and instead cares far more about reaching their benchmarks. Aspects like this are why Dot is often a very strong team for most accounts, and will be one of the strongest teams to recommend to a newer player. This is because relic quality is often one of the many bottlenecks for a team to become usable. So subpar relic quality may not be acceptable for compositions like hypercarries. But for a team like Dot, hitting stat benchmarks is truthfully the only goal to reach. So sacrificing offensive subs like attack percent in the pursuit of those benchmarks hurts far less than doing the same for someone like Anaxa. But it's also important to look at this concept in the opposite perspective, which is that you're rewarded for having an exceptional build on someone like a hypercarry. In contrast to a team like Dot, every individual substat yields a far bigger increase and a more noticeable impact on your performance. So then, funneling all of your Trailblaze power into your favorite hypercarry, gaining as many valuable substats as possible, and devoting a countless amount of time into them can actually lead to visible improvements, unlike other archetypes. For this reason, you often hear that teams like Dot or Break have a very high floor, but a lower ceiling than archetypes like hypercarries or Mono Remembrance. But it's important to note that this comparison is strictly through the perspective of relic quality, as the way that Dot and Break balance this problem is through their extremely strong early Eidolons. But it's important to understand that, much like Stellar Jades, getting what you want is ultimately gated through RNG. Even though resources might be there to alleviate the process, farming for a character could take far longer for one account than another. Relic quality is, unfortunately, one of the many factors that can gatekeep an account from reaching its goals. However, understanding which teams gain more from relic investment, utilizing the newer resources like self-modeling resin or variable dice, and using Trailblaze power in efficient caverns while using relic remains on an important set from a bad cavern are some of the many ways to circumvent the problem. So then, when you realize that Trailblaze power, just like any other resource, has a value that fluctuates depending on how it's used, you start to understand just how impactful it can be. But you may be tired of hearing about investment types that rely on RNG, so let's shift our focus to something that has none of it: player skill. Now when you hear this initially, it may seem a little weird since Star Rail, or any turn-based RPG, isn't really known for its skill expression. However, where Star Rail lacks in mechanical skill, it more than makes up for in the value of decision making, utilizing the mechanics of a kit, and abusing certain effects to their limit. Funnily enough, it's this area of the game that most people tend to ignore, even though investing their time into learning how to play a character or team is often the best way to improve their clears, and is entirely free. There are countless examples out there, but I'd like to start with likely the most misunderstood character in the game, Cyrene. Now Cyrene at E0 is often described as underwhelming in any team that isn't Mono Remembrance, as her ultimate takes far too long to proc. And while I have personally hated this aspect of her kit, and don't even disagree with the premise per se, I think a lot of players have never been told how to cheat out free recollection stacks for her ultimate. So to rectify this problem, let's have a rundown of how her stack generation works. Now, the most important aspect to understand about her kit is that the individual recollection stack each teammate can provide, barring Mammoth's rights, is reset after each Cyrene action. However, to create that recollection stack, the teammate just needs to act. This is very important, as a character acting doesn't necessarily mean that they need to take a turn, meaning any out-of-turn action will also create a recollection stack. This includes things like ultimates, follow-up attacks, and even something as trivial as Cyridra's action that converts her peerage buff into coup de main. This knowledge opens the gateway to so many different possibilities, as saving ultimates, aligning follow-ups, and correct speed tuning can lead you to cheat out more recollection stacks than you'd get otherwise. But let's go one step further, by using this concept to explain why Anaxa, a DPS that's often called simple or flexible, is actually one of the DPS to gain the most from player skill. Now, I think we can all agree that Cyrene and Cyridra were a significant increase to Anaxa's teams, but it's very likely that many Anaxa players aren't even pushing this trio anywhere near their limits. This is the case because there are many small adjustments you can make to your gameplay that lead to significant improvements in clear speeds. But focusing on Cyrene, it's pretty clear to see that this isn't mono remembrance, so her stack generation will mostly rely on teammates, not memo sprites. Because of this, cheating out more stacks will be pivotal in reaching Cyrene's ultimate at a reasonable speed. Firstly, putting Von Wyk on her in this team, alongside ideally reaching 180 speed, are pivotal in rectifying her ramp-up issues. This is something you can easily afford to do in this team, because Cyrene will have almost zero damage contribution here, so you can instead hyperfixate on speed subs. Then another important adjustment is saving your ultimates to use when Cyrene will act twice before your teammates. For example, a way to cheat out 3 free recollection stacks is giving Cyrene's first buff to Cyridra. Then before you give Cyrene's second buff to Anaxa, use the ultimates on all 3 other team members. This technique isn't exclusive to Anaxa's team, by the way, but is most important to abuse here, as Cyrene's ults onto Anaxa is the largest source of damage, so getting more of them is important. And lastly, the combination of running Cyridra on attack boots, ER rope, and DDD can help in not only providing Anaxa the most amount of attack percent possible, a stat that he's very starved for, but also gaining enough energy to effectively spam DDD and provide more turns for Cyrene, which will help a lot to alleviate her stack generation problems. Mind you, this is only a fraction of the optimizations available, as the nuance within skill expression for just his team alone can be the focus of a whole video. For instance, there's the importance of running Cyrene on Windset, aligning Cyrene's ultimate buff on Anaxa correctly with Cyridra's peerage stacks, and the insane damage difference when running him sustainless with RMC, just to name a few. And while there's far more examples I can bring up, I hope you're starting to see how investing your time into learning a team can lead to your perception of a character being far different from reality. So with all of that nuance out of the way, let's get a direct answer on whether investment is important. And while its value fluctuates depending on your goals, I can say with 100% certainty that investment is very important. But what's the best way to do so is far harder to discern. For instance, an Anaxa team gains very little in Eidolon investment, to the point where Cyrene's E2 feels like the only Eidolon that really does anything. However, it balances that out by gaining the most from player skill compared to almost any other team in the game. For a team like Dot, you gain very little from high relic quality, but get a lot from attaining a few E1s. Then for Mono Remembrance, you'd gain a lot from some Eidolons and high relic quality on each team member, but there's far lower skill expression as a result, though some variants have higher than others. But no matter how you end up doing it, investing in your teams will be the best way to perform better in this game. Just know that investment encompasses far more than grabbing an Eidolon and calling it a day. So with all of that in mind, the next time you plan on making further investments in a team, ask yourselves this: what's the most impactful way to invest? Unfortunately, I can't take full credit for this idea, as Alex's recommendation was the main inspiration for this video. but I tried to put my own spin on things and put more focus on the niche aspects of investment, of which there are plenty. Speaking of that, while making the script on the player skill segment, I realized there was actually a lot more nuance at the topic, and so many examples that I could choose from. I ended up choosing Sarini, and by extension Anaxa, mostly because of her upcoming rerun, but there's so much more that can be said, and so many other examples out there. So if you'd like to see a video focused entirely on player skill, and its impact on certain characters, looking specifically at Zila and Fei Xiao with this one, let me know in the comments. Anyways though, bye-bye!